In this video, I'm going to talk about whether or not war games are too expensive. And what exactly does expensive mean anyway? If you've been involved in tabletop wargaming for really any amount of time, you've probably heard that old chestnut thrown around about how, well, wargaming is really expensive. But is it really? Is it really that expensive? What exactly does expensive mean? Okay, well, if we take two things, if we take a can of soda and a rocket ship, and the rocket ship costs $2 billion and the can of soda costs $1, the rocket ship is more expensive. That can be, sussed out mathematically. But when we start talking about this is expensive or that is expensive, just in and of itself, we're talking about relative terms, because what one person might think, well, $20 that's not a lot, that's a lot of money. To another person, $1,000 might be a lot of money, whereas $20 is not so much. And that totally depends on how much money you make, where you live, your personal, goals in life, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of things that can go into that. So when we start talking about this particular model is expensive or this line of models is expensive, we are making a value judgment. People are saying, well, I don't particularly find this to be useful at this price. That's really what you're saying. When you're saying something is too expensive, you're saying I value it less than I value that amount of money. So, why is that? Why do people in some situations value specifics war games less than other things? And the answer is I honestly don't know. But I really feel personally myself, and this is my opinion, I don't believe wargaming is too expensive, and I'll kind of try to compare it to some other things so you can kind of see the differences. So if we're going to compare wargaming to some other hobbies, you can go a lot of different directions when you start comparing hobbies. Drawing can be very, very cheap. You need to find a pencil and you need to find a piece of paper and you can start drawing. On the other hand, if you really, really, really like drawing, you can buy a Wacom Cintiq tablet, which is an electronic tablet where you draw like on the screen with an electric pencil, and it's like this big, and it goes into your computer into Photoshop, and you digitally paint and all that stuff. And they cost like $2,400. And then you still need to plug them into a computer. So there's a very big difference between I found a pencil and a piece of paper versus, $4,000 worth of hardware, plus the software and all that other jazz. So every hobby has got a range. Some people like to fish. I looked on Gander Mountain and I found some rod and reel combos between 20 and 40 bucks. You need line and lures and a bucket and stuff like that. Let's say another 40 bucks. So let's just say $80 and you're out fishing and you're having a good time. Now again, this is all retail. You might find a used rod, you might buy something on eBay, but just to keep all the comparisons the same, I'm talking about retail. On the other hand, besides just spending that maybe 80 bucks to go out and start fishing on the shore, I know a guy who's got a friend who owns a $40,000 bass boat. That's twice as much as my car. So, again, all these kind of things, all these different hobbies can have ranges. And the trick, I think, to make things not too expensive is to maybe not go overboard. But the real trick is to say, what is the value that I put on this hobby? The person who spends $40,000 on a bass boat must really, really, really love to fish. Or they have more money than they know what to do with. Or maybe they really love to fish and they're trying to get into it professionally to the point where they're winning purses at tournaments and they've got sponsorship and stuff like that. That's a thing that kind of doesn't happen really too much in the wargaming world. We're looking at it more from, this is a game that we play that we enjoy. You might go to tournaments, you might win some prizes. You might win a trophy. You might win nothing. But the fact is that the cost differences are very different. And that's where the expense becomes a little murky. So let's try to compare wargaming, our wargaming, to some other types of gaming. Maybe we're getting a little bit more apples to apples there. If you want to get into PC gaming, and you don't have a computer at all, doing a little bit of research, I find that a gaming PC that you build yourself, about the cheapest you can get away with is between $500 and about $650. And then you're still going to need a monitor, which is like between $100, maybe $150. And then you've got yourself a decent gaming PC. Now, you need to buy games The most expensive that generally games are, unless you get into a weird, collector's edition, is usually about 60 bucks, maybe 50, but usually 60. You can obviously get games considerably cheaper if you go through companies like Steam, where you download them and they have special sales sometimes. There are people who wait all year long for Steam sales and then buy a ton of games for super crazy cheap, 90% off, that kind of stuff. So let's just say that something like PC gaming is going to maybe cost you, I don't know, let's just say 800 bucks. Okay, well that's it. Basically, if you want to get in the door, you can't spend $85 and get into PC gaming. If you don't have a computer and you don't have the stuff, you can't do it. So, that's kind of expensive, but there are plenty of people out there who are absolutely happy to do so. What about console video gaming? We're going to assume you already have a television, but if you want an Xbox or a PC or a PlayStation, you're going to spend between 300 and 400 bucks roughly, and then games cost anywhere from about 20 to 60. So maybe you're spending as little as $350 and you can start playing pretty much right out of the box. That's also not an insubstantial amount of money. Now, let's actually look at some prices in wargaming. Technically, HeroClix is a wargame. Some people here will say, no, it's not a wargame. But you have little miniatures. They go on a board. You count range. You see if you're in cover. You check, movement and all that kind of stuff. Admittedly, they're pre-paints. They generally look like somebody painted them with their elbow, just kind of like holding the model and just rubbing paint on, and they're like, there you go, there's Batman. But that doesn't mean that they're not war games. You can get a starter for HeroClix, Blackest Night DC starter for about 30 bucks retail. So that's a pretty inexpensive in to get into wargaming. Now, something that looks a lot nicer, in my mind plays a lot nicer, and I think is more popular these days, Star Wars X-Wing, okay? Those models do not look like they were painted with someone's elbows. They look really quite nice. You can get the starter box for $40 retail. It comes with 2 TIE fighters and an X-Wing. Comes with the rulers and the dice and the instructions and the cards and all that stuff for 40 bucks. Plus, you can play it with 2 people. I can be the X-Wing and you can be the 2 TIE fighters or whatever. That's a great way to get into wargaming because as you want to add on, those ships are between $15 and $30 unless you get crazy and buy something like that frigate back there. But generally, yeah, you can get into wargaming through something like X-Wing, which is also very popular right now, for really inexpensive, which is a thing you can't do with other types of gaming hobbies sometimes. Okay, but now let's say you're one of those guys who's like, no, it's not wargaming unless I have to paint it. All right, that's your opinion, that's cool. Let's say we're going to go that route. You can get a Reaper starter basic paint kit for about 60 bucks. It's going to come with brushes. It's going to come with, like a dozen paints, a case. It's going to come with even some figures to practice on, some of those Bones guys. And like I said, about 60 bucks. You're going to need probably some spray primer. You're going to need some clippers, some files. Let's just say it's an extra $40 worth of stuff. So you're looking at 100 bucks. So you spend 100 bucks, you now have enough things to paint and to build and to glue and do all that stuff, and you are ready to roll. Now you need to pick a game. Now, up until just recently, the whole it's very expensive to get into wargaming argument kind of held a lot of water when you were thinking about Games Workshop. A lot of times when people are saying, oh, wargaming is very expensive, they really mean Games Workshop is very expensive. And for the most part, that's totally true. But now they've started to kind of, I think, turn, and they're trying to maybe help that a little bit. Many of you have seen the Getting Started boxes. They cost 85 bucks, and they give you your choice of forces for the price of a little bit less than those 3 guys on the horses that... Did I just rap? Anyway, the Varangard are 100 bucks for 3 guys on horseback, which I've bitched about before, frankly. But for 85 bucks, you can get an entire little force to start playing in something like Age of Sigmar. Now, the reason I'm telling you to look at it Age of Sigmar-wise is because you can download the rules for free, and you can get all the stats you need to run those guys for free. They make those same sets, those Getting Started sets, for 40K as well, but you kind of need a codex, you kind of need the book. So those are some different, pretty high expenses that make it more and more like trying to get into video gaming. But if you just went to start playing Age of Sigmar, you bought yourself your paints and your all that jazz, 100 bucks. Now you spend $85 on a Getting Start force. You're going to have a good time putting them together. You're going to have a good time painting them, and then you'll be able to play as soon as you're done. You've got a working army ready to go. But can we do cheaper than that? With Games Workshop, technically, yeah. I mean, you could just buy like a box of skeletons like I talked about in the Why Age of Sigmar is a Good Idea game. You could just do that, and do that kind of stuff. But Are there cheaper ideas and ways to kind of go about it without doing Games Workshop? You may have to guess that the answer is yes, absolutely. Malifaux is a great game with models that, in my opinion, are any bit as good as Games Workshop's plastics. They're amazing looking models. You can buy a starter book, the little one, for $15. $15. You can buy a crew, which is usually between 6 and 8 figures, for $40 to $50, okay? And then you can buy a deck of cards, the Fate deck, for like $12. You could technically use a deck of poker, cards, but in this situation, you're set there. So again, now less for $100, you've got an entire game, printed rules book, a core crew to work with, and the cards you need for the game. And that's less than $100. Now, you also, again, need to paint them and glue them and all that jazz, but you've already, dropped your $100 on all your tools for that other part. So now for $200, you are into a whole new game that you can play competitively with people and all kinds of stuff. You get to build it all, if that's your thing. And, that's pretty cheap. That's cheaper than PlayStation. I know, I have a PlayStation. But can it be even cheaper? Sure. Again, we're still talking retail. I'm not even getting near, going on eBay and stuff like that. There's a game I've talked about plenty of times here before called Song of Blades and Heroes. Song of Blades and Heroes is an $8 PDF that you buy and download, okay? So $8, you get your entire rules booklet. Then, let's say you go buy some Reaper Bones, those little plastic figures that Reaper makes. Those guys are $3 a piece. Maybe you buy 8 or 10 of them. So maybe you spent $30 on figures. You spent $8 on the book, and maybe you spent a couple of bucks on dice or something, or you found some dice in your Yahtzee in the closet. Whatever you're going to do. My point is that for as little as $40, which is, again, getting us back to the X-Wing price, but now it's still something you've got to paint, you can get into wargaming, which you can't do that in a lot of other hobbies that are gaming related. Like I said with PlayStation, like I said with PC, there's no way to do that for that amount of money, generally, when we're talking retail. If you buy a used Wii from your neighbor for $50, well, that's a different story altogether. But my point is that when people talk about wargaming being expensive, yeah, there are things that can be expensive. They make a Warlord Titan over at Forge World, which is GW's fancy arm. It's $1,800. That guy's like 3 foot tall. That's pretty expensive. I mean, it's not a bass boat, but it's pretty expensive. That's really the trick, In a lot of other hobbies, like if you were really into fishing, you could take a half day from work, and after lunch, you could go to the dealership and drive home with a trailer on the back of your vehicle with a $40,000 bass boat on it. It would be very difficult to spend $40,000 at your local game store in an afternoon. They would like you to come try, certainly, but it would be very difficult to do so. You could buy a whole bunch of Forge World stuff, and then have pros paint it. You could really spend a ton of money that way. But I think that the whole point of is wargaming too expensive is to maybe compare it to other types of gaming, compare it to other hobbies in general, and then maybe think, is the way that you're doing it too expensive? If you think it's too expensive because it is to you, well, then maybe you don't play Warhammer. Maybe play something else, X-Wing. Maybe play Song of Blades and Heroes. Maybe play, if Warhammer's the only way you can do it, well, yeah, then you may have to look into the Getting Started box. You may have to look into buying a starter box like the Dark Vengeance with your friend, and then both of you trade back and forth, and then you get all the Chaos Space Marines and he gets all the Dark Angels or whatever. There's a lot of different options you can do in those situations to make it cheaper. And just to saying, over and over again, oh, it's so expensive, it's so expensive. If it's really that expensive, then maybe you should save your money.